There are thousands of years of Sith lore, dark, complex, and genuinely amazing, that Disney chose to completely ignore. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what they walked away from. Not a highlight reel, not a summary of the greatest hits, the actual history, the origin, the philosophy, the architects of one of fiction's most elaborately constructed villain civilizations, built from the ruins of their own failure and sustained across 7,000 years of warfare, alchemy, and ruthless political succession. This material lived in what Lucasfilm called the expanded universe. Novels, comics, game sourcebooks, and role-playing supplements assembled over decades by writers who understood that great mythology requires deep roots. In April 2014, following Disney's 2012 acquisition of Lucasfilm, all of it was relabeled Legends, meaning non-canonical, meaning optional, meaning set aside. What Disney placed in the ancient Sith's narrative space was, largely, nothing. Korriban, the sacred burial world of the Sith Lords, was renamed Moraband and given a brief appearance in the Clone Wars animated series. The thousands of years of civilization behind that name were quietly shelved. So let's go back to what was on that shelf, because what was there is extraordinary. The Schism, 7003 BBY. The Jedi Order in 7003 BBY had existed for approximately 18,000 years. It had already survived one civil war, the First Great Schism, roughly 25,000 BBY, led by a Jedi named Zendor and his followers, the Legions of Leto. That revolt was crushed. The Order rebuilt, codified, and over millennia arrived at the philosophy it would carry into the Republic era: selflessness, emotional discipline, service to the light side of the Force, and a deep suspicion of any power that came through desire rather than serenity. A faction of Jedi found that suspicion intolerable. They had discovered something in the dark side the Order didn't want to acknowledge. Not corruption, but access. Access to a form of Force manipulation the light side couldn't replicate. They called it alchemy. Dark side alchemy. The ability to permanently alter living matter through the Force. Not healing, not enhancement. Transformation. Biology reshaped at its most fundamental level. Organisms rewritten into things they were never meant to be. The Jedi Council condemned the practice categorically. The practitioners refused to stop, because what they were discovering in the experiments suggested the Jedi's entire framework for understanding the Force was incomplete. The power was real. The Order was afraid of it. To these Jedi, that fear was evidence of a larger failure. This was the ideological fracture. In 7003 BBY, it became the Second Great Schism, a formal split between the Jedi Order and the Dark Jedi who refused to back down. Some accounts note that certain members of this faction saw themselves as heirs to Zendor's rebellion, the earlier schism having established an ideological precedent they were now continuing. 3 years of escalating tension followed, and by 7000 BBY, arguing had given way to something the Jedi Order had never quite prepared for: open war against former brothers and sisters who had weaponized the alchemy the Council had tried to forbid. The 100-Year Darkness, 7000 to 6900 BBY. The creatures the Dark Jedi built during this conflict had a name: Leviathans. Enormous biological weapons, engineered through dark side alchemy from living matter, reshaped into something monstrous. Standard Jedi training covered lightsaber technique, Force application, and diplomatic negotiation. It didn't cover what to do when your opponents were manufacturing organisms as weapons. The Dark Jedi had spent years developing these capabilities before the Jedi Council condemned them, and by the time the war started, the Leviathans were a functioning military asset. Jedi training had not prepared them, as the sources put it, for former brothers and sisters who commanded armies of creatures that shouldn't exist. The war ran for roughly a century. The 100-Year Darkness, from 7000 to approximately 6900 BBY, 100 years during which the Dark Jedi demonstrated what happened when you combined Jedi-level Force mastery with a total willingness to cross every line the Order had drawn. They lost anyway. The decisive engagement came at Corbos, the Battle of Corbos, sometimes called the Rout of Corbos. The Jedi Order, backed by the Republic, achieved a military victory comprehensive enough to end the war. The Dark Jedi were broken. The Leviathans they had built were left behind on Corbos, stranded without handlers, dangerous, no longer anyone's strategic asset. The Jedi Order then made a decision that would define the next 7,000 years of galactic history. Rather than executing the defeated Dark Jedi, they exiled them, cast them into uncharted space beyond Republic borders, reportedly in the hope that they might reflect on their mistakes and in time return to the light side. They had just spent 100 years at war with these people. The optimism required for that hope is staggering. The Dark Jedi didn't reflect on their mistakes. The Gen Jedi. The 12 leaders who survived Corbos had a name in the Sith language, Gen Jedi. Dark Jedi, but with a specific weight, exiles who had made their choice openly and been punished for it. Among them were Zozan, Carnus Mur, and Remulus Drapa, who would later attempt a failed return to Republic space before the exile was fully complete. But the two figures who matter most to the story that follows are Ajunta Pall and Sorza Sin. Ajunta Pall had been a Jedi Master, not a knight who lost his way before his training was finished, a master, someone who had walked the light side long enough to understand it completely and then rejected it deliberately. He led the Dark Jedi throughout the 100-Year Darkness, organized the Leviathan campaigns, commanded a century of war against his former order. His fall wasn't a seduction or a moment of weakness. It was a conclusion that the Jedi Order's framework for the Force was fundamentally wrong, that the dark side offered real power the Order was too afraid to acknowledge, and that he was willing to pay whatever price that conviction carried. A Jedi Master becoming the first Dark Lord of the Sith isn't a story about weakness. It's a story about what happens when genuine conviction follows its logic past every border that should have stopped it. Sorza Sin was something different. Where Paul commanded, Sin documented. She was a Dark Jedi alchemist and philosopher, someone whose instinct, even during the 100-Year Darkness, even during a century of war, was to understand and record what she observed. She started a journal, not a manifesto, not propaganda, a chronicle, a careful first-person account of what she witnessed, what she practiced, what she discovered, and what she believed. Her entries covered the Second Great Schism from the inside, the nature of the dark side experiments that had triggered the Jedi Council's condemnation, the exile, and then everything that came after. That journal didn't stay private. Centuries later, Darth Sidious, who combined a political genius for galactic domination with a collector's instinct for dark side history, assembled 6 legendary dark side texts into a single volume called the Book of Sith, Secrets from the Dark Side. Sorza Sin's Chronicle is the first text in that collection, the oldest, the foundation on which everything else rests. When Palpatine was studying Sith history, Sin's words were the first he read. The exiles didn't know any of that yet. They were adrift in uncharted space, with no home, no republic, no Jedi Order to define themselves against, and 100 years of war behind them. They were looking for somewhere to land. Korriban. The planet they found was called Korriban. Red-skied, desolate, ancient. A world with the kind of dark side saturation that accumulates over thousands of years of death and ritual. A palpable heaviness in the Force that trained users could feel the moment they entered the system. It wasn't uninhabited. The Sith species had been on Korriban long before the Republic was young. Physically humanoid, but unmistakably alien. Red-skinned, with tentacle-like facial appendages, physically imposing, and culturally defined by warfare and hierarchical dominance. Their society was built on strength, their politics resolved through combat, and their spiritual framework was already rooted in the dark side of the Force. The Sith species had their own Force traditions before any exile arrived. Their own alchemy, their own knowledge of dark side power, their own relationship with what the Jedi Order had spent millennia classifying as forbidden. This matters. The Dark Jedi exiles didn't bring dark side power to Korriban. They brought dark side power at a scale and refinement the Sith species had never encountered. Sin recorded her first assessment of the native population in her journal. The notes survive in paraphrase across later sources, and her conclusion was stark. She and her fellow exiles, even before they had fully recovered from a century of war and reached what she called their primes, were more powerful than the Sith purebloods who received them. A trained Jedi Master who had spent 100 years fighting, with all the dark side weight that produces, was simply beyond anything the Sith species had encountered in their own tradition. The Jedi arrived, and the Sith species looked at them as gods. Ajunta Pall wasn't interested in being worshipped. The Sith king ruling Korriban at the time of their arrival was named Hakagram Grosh. Paul killed him, beheaded him, and claimed the throne directly, presenting himself as a blood heir to the ancestral king Adas, a legendary Sith ruler from an earlier era who had repelled an alien invasion and unified the species. The political maneuver was simultaneously brutal and sophisticated, not divine right, but lineage. He was fitting himself into the existing Sith succession framework by the most direct route available. You can't argue inheritance with a man who just removed the incumbent. Sin and the remaining Jedi became his shadow hands, advisors, enforcers, and the foundation of the new ruling council. If that suggests stability, Sin's journal entries from this period, as documented in later accounts of the text, suggest otherwise. She was already noting the possibility of overthrowing Paul. The Sith tradition of constant internal competition, the apprentice-killing master dynamic that would define the order for thousands of years, wasn't a practice imported from later generations. It was present from the founding moment, baked in by the personalities of the people who built the Empire. The Empire built on a defeat. What Ajunta Pall constructed on Korriban's foundation became, over generations, a civilization. The administrative capital wasn't Korriban itself. Ziost, a nearby planet, became the Empire's political seat, its center of government, its administrative hub. Korriban was reserved for something else entirely. The world where the most powerful Sith Lords would be interred, a place of accumulated dark side energy that grew heavier and more potent with each new burial. Sacred, not in the religious sense the word implies in most traditions, but in the way a site becomes sacred when enormous power concentrates there over centuries. The valley on Korriban that would receive the great Dark Lords had a name before the Empire arrived: the Valley of the Sleeping Kings. As the tombs multiplied across the generations, it became the Valley of the Dark Lords. The political hierarchy the founding exiles imposed was brutally functional. The Jedi, trained force masters hardened by a century of warfare, sat at the top. The native Sith Lords beneath them, the warrior class beneath those, and over generations, the bloodlines merged. The Dark Jedi and the Sith species interbred, a process the legend sources describe as occurring through Sith alchemy, though the specific mechanisms aren't detailed in surviving accounts. What the hybridization produced across centuries was something genuinely new, a people carrying both Jedi-trained dark side power in their lineage and the indigenous Sith species' own Force traditions. Force-sensitive by birth, immersed in dark side philosophy from their earliest years, ruling an empire built on twin foundations, a foreign conquest and an indigenous tradition, fused over centuries into something neither culture could have produced independently. This is why the word Sith carries two meanings simultaneously, and always has. It names the original red-skinned species of Korriban, the red-skinned species the exiles found when they arrived. It also names the philosophical tradition built on top of that species' culture by human exiles who turned a military defeat into an empire. When you call someone a Sith Lord, you're invoking both at once, the conquered culture and the conquering philosophy, two things that became one thing across 2,000 years of intermixture. Marka Ragnos, who ruled the empire roughly 2 millennia after the founding, born before 5100 BBY, described in legends as one of the most legendary figures in all of Sith history, was himself a half-breed. By his era, the hybridization wasn't a founding event someone remembered. it was simply biology. The man who represented the Sith Empire at its political apex was the product of 2 millennia of that hybridization running its course. The Code. Ziost, 6900 BBY. On Ziost, in 6900 BBY, Sorza Sin wrote the Sith Code. Not a philosophical treatise, not a strategic document. 6 lines, built to be memorized, recited, and lived by. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Sin noted in her journal, and accounts of the text confirm this, that she understood both the Sith Code and the Sithari prophecy she was simultaneously recording as perversions of Jedi tenets. Not rejections, perversions, which is a different thing entirely. A perversion takes the original structure and inverts its conclusions while preserving its form. The Jedi Code offers peace, serenity, knowledge, harmony, union with the Force. Sin's code doesn't argue those things are worthless. It calls them lies. And then it offers a sequence that leads somewhere the Jedi Code never does. Work through the code line by line, and you find an internally coherent philosophy, not a slogan for villainy. Peace is a lie is a specific claim, that the serenity the Jedi valued was suppression, not genuine peace. Real peace, the line implies, doesn't require you to amputate your emotional life to sustain it. There is only passion, is the alternative premise. Desire, ambition, grief, rage, these aren't obstacles to understanding the Force. They are the mechanism through which the Force moves through you most powerfully. The Jedi said control your emotions. Sin said feel them, and they will make you stronger. The transactional sequence, passion to strength to power to victory, is relentless in its logic. Each line is a natural consequence of the last. You don't need to believe in the dark side for the sequence to make sense. You just need to believe that desire is fuel rather than poison. And then the final 2 lines arrive. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. The chains are the critical detail. The code implies chains already exist, that some form of bondage is the default condition, that what the Jedi call virtue is in fact constraint. Sith don't pursue power because they're evil, according to this philosophy. They pursue it because the alternative is captivity. The Force, experienced fully through passion rather than filtered through Jedi discipline, will accomplish what the Jedi Order never could: liberation. Not from responsibility, not from consequence, but from the limits the Order had constructed and called enlightenment. Sin wrote the code to point at the failings of the Jedi framework. She wasn't simply being contrary. She was a Jedi-trained dark side practitioner who had spent a century examining the difference between the 2 traditions from the inside. And she had reached a conclusion about which one told the truth about power and freedom. The code is that conclusion in 6 lines. You can reject this entirely. The expanded universe doesn't require you to accept it. But it took it seriously, built a civilization's worth of lore on the philosophy, showed what that civilization looked like across 2,000 years, demonstrated its costs and its genuine coherence. The dark side in this material isn't cartoonishly evil. It's a real philosophical position with devastating consequences, and that distinction is precisely what makes the lore feel like a masterpiece rather than backstory. The Sithari. Sin closed the foundational entries of her chronicle, the ones that would form the oldest section of Sidious's collected texts, with the Sith Code and one further document, the Sithari prophecy. Sithari means the perfect Sith. The Sith equivalent of the Jedi's chosen one, a figure prophesied to arise, lead the Sith to absolute supremacy, then destroy the Sith as they existed, and through that destruction, make them more powerful than they had ever been. The being who was simultaneously the ultimate Sith and the annihilator of the Sith Order, the instrument of both perfection and obliteration. Sin herself recognized the structural parallel she was recording. She was encoding a dark side prophecy about a chosen one at the same moment she was encoding a philosophy she called a perversion of Jedi tenets. The Jedi had their chosen one who would bring balance to the Force. The Sith had their chosen one who would bring them ultimate power at the cost of everything they'd built. Both traditions were writing promissory notes payable at an unspecified future date, to a recipient neither tradition could identify. The primary candidate across Legends lore for fulfillment of the sithari is Darth Bane. Roughly 5,900 years after Sin recorded the prophecy on Ziost, Bane looked at the Sith Brotherhood, dozens of Sith Lords, locked in perpetual infighting, bloated and self-defeating, and dismantled it entirely. The Brotherhood had fought the Jedi Order in the New Sith Wars for roughly 1,000 years. Bane decided the structure was fundamentally wrong. Too many Sith meant constant internal warfare, too much visibility, too much exposure to Jedi detection. He destroyed the Brotherhood. He killed, or allowed the deaths of, essentially every other Sith Lord. And he rebuilt from the wreckage with two people, a master and one apprentice, the rule of two. The Sithari prophecy said the perfect Sith would destroy the Sith to make them stronger. Bane destroyed the Sith Brotherhood and made the surviving Sith, two of them, concealed in shadow, more dangerous than an army had ever been. If Bane is the Sithari, then the prophecy Sorza's Sin recorded on Ziost in 6,900 BBY reached its fulfillment 5,900 years later in a single Dark Lord's decision to burn everything down and rebuild it on better principles. But the lore doesn't close the question at Bane. Because the Jedi had a chosen one prophecy too, and its fulfillment was Anakin Skywalker, who became Darth Vader, who destroyed the Sith. Not the Brotherhood this time, the entire rule of two lineage. By throwing Emperor Palpatine into the Death Star's reactor shaft, Vader ended the Baneite succession. He fulfilled the Jedi's prophecy about balance, and in doing so, he destroyed the Sith as they existed, which is exactly what the Sithari was supposed to accomplish. If Vader is both the Chosen One and the Sithari, both prophecies pointed at the same person. The Jedi's hope and the Sith's ideal, both fulfilled by a single man who was neither entirely and both entirely at different moments in the same tragic life. Sorza's Sin, writing on Ziost, observed that the Sithari prophecy was a perversion of a Jedi idea. She couldn't have known that the perversion and the original might share one resolution, that the first Sith text she wrote and the Jedi prophecy she was inverting would converge in a man 6,000 years later who had been both a Jedi Knight and a Dark Lord, and who ended both traditions in the same act. That's the kind of long-range internal coherence the expanded universe built. 7,000 years of mythology where the threads connect. Tulak Hord, Lord of Hate. The early Sith Empire produced rulers that legends documented with varying levels of detail. Most received biographies. Tulak Hord received something different, a reputation so overwhelming that the absence of specifics is itself the story. His titles were the Lord of Hate and the Master of the Gathering Darkness. He ruled during the early Sith Empire, in the generations following the founding, before the hybridization had fully matured, before the Valley of the Dark Lords had collected the names that would define it. His tomb rests there now, alongside Ajunta Pall, Marka Ragnos, and Naga Sadow, the company the Empire kept for its greatest Dark Lords. The primary legends sources for Tulak Hord come from Star Wars: The Old Republic, the 2011 MMO set 3,000 years after the founding. Specifically, the game's codex entries, internal documents of the SWTOR-era Sith Empire, recording what that later civilization understood about the earlier one. What those entries say about Tulak Hord is precise and devastating in its implications. The secrets behind Tulak Hord's great power were many, and they all but vanished from the galaxy with the Dark Lord's death. Not were passed on to worthy successors. Not are preserved in the archives of Korriban. They vanished. Whatever Tulak Hord had mastered, some fusion of force technique, dark side alchemy, and combat method that made him categorically different from the Sith who preceded and followed him, he either couldn't transmit it or chose not to. When he died, it was gone. The Subtor-era Sith, operating 2,000 years after his death, were still trying to recover fragments of it. The Inquisitor-class storyline in that game centers explicitly on hunting Tulak Hord's artifacts. Other Sith Lords, millennia later, searching for what a dead man knew and took with him. That pursuit connects to his combat reputation. Legends sources consistently position Tulak Hord as one of the greatest lightsaber duelists in Sith history. Some accounts frame him as potentially the greatest who ever lived, though the fan community debates this vigorously, partly because the early Sith Empire predates the fully developed lightsaber tradition that would characterize the KOTOR era and the prequel period, making direct comparison difficult. The SWTOR Codex doesn't settle the debate. It records his reputation as the later Sith understood it: anomalous, categorically different, something that couldn't be explained by the metrics that made sense for everyone else. The one concrete record of Tulak Hord in formal Sith combat is his Kagath. A Kagath was a ritualized Sith challenge, a formal duel or war carrying the full weight of Sith law, where the loser typically lost everything: titles, army, followers, life. Tulak Hord fought exactly one Kagath in his documented history. He won. And then he made a decision that reveals more about his character than any battle description could. He declared that the name of his defeated opponent would be struck from history entirely. Not executed in a memorable way. Not enslaved as a demonstration. Erased. The opponent's name does not exist in the Legends canon. You can read the SWTOR Codex entry about Tulak Hord's Kagath, learn everything about the victor, and find nothing about who he defeated. Because Tulak Hord decided his defeated opponent shouldn't exist in the record, and the record complied. The name is gone. The Kagath is incomplete in the only way a Kagath could be incomplete. Its loser was retroactively removed from existence. This is the most thoroughly Sith thing that has ever been documented. Total military and political victory wasn't sufficient. The defeated person's continued existence within the historical record was an insult. So the record was corrected. Tulak Hord is the Dark Lord whose biography is defined less by what's in it than by what he removed from everyone else's. His secrets died with him. His opponent's name died before him. His artifacts were hunted across millennia by Sith who understood they were missing something they couldn't recreate. What survives is the void he left and the reputation that filled it. Lord of Hate, Master of the Gathering Darkness, the only Sith who won his Kagath by erasing his opponent so completely that the victory itself became half a story. Marka Ragnos and the Long Middle. The Sith Empire, between its founding and the Great Hyperspace War, spans roughly 1,900 years. That's not a gap in the story. It's the story. 2 millennia of political development, cultural consolidation, alchemical refinement, and architectural ambition. The great burial complexes the Sith built on Korriban were constructed during this period. The Valley of the Sleeping Kings filled with tombs. The Dark Lords who filled it became increasingly shaped by the hybridization. Part human exile lineage, part native Sith species, entirely immersed in a philosophical tradition Sorza Sin had laid down on Ziost in the Empire's founding year. Marka Ragnos is the figure who best represents the Empire at its political height. Born before 5100 BBY, a half-breed, human Dark Jedi lineage and Sith species ancestry, the product of 2 millennia of hybridization running its course. Legends describes him as one of the most legendary figures in all of Sith history, which is a significant distinction in a tradition that includes Ajunta Pall, Tulak Hord, and the Dark Lords who came after. He dueled a Sith Lord named Simus and won. Sith succession wasn't determined by bureaucratic selection, but by force combat, the philosophy of the Code expressed as institutional policy. You are the strongest because you demonstrated you are the strongest. The throne belongs to whoever can hold it. Ragnos held it for a long time. His death, around 5000 BBY, created a vacuum, immediately filled by two rival claimants, Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh, who argued over his succession while Republic explorers accidentally stumbled into Sith space. Sadow used the arrival of Republic scouts as justification to launch the Great Hyperspace War against the Republic. The war went badly for the Sith. The Republic retaliated. The empire the Jedi had built from a defeated exile's gamble on a red planet fractured. But from Corbos to the Great Hyperspace War covers roughly 1,900 years. From Ajunta Pall beheading Hakagram Grouch to Marka Ragnos dying on Ziost, the civilization he founded ran, expanded, fought, developed its philosophy and its alchemy, produced Dark Lords who left their tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords, a valley that grew heavier with dark side power every time another great Sith was added to it. Sorza Sin's journal documented the beginning of that accumulation. The valley was still accumulating when the Republic came to destroy what the Empire had become. The tomb, and 3,000 years later. 3,000 years after Ajunta Pall died on Korriban, a Force user named Revan walked into his tomb. Knights of the Old Republic, BioWare's 2003 RPG, one of the most critically acclaimed Star Wars games ever made, is the primary game through which the ancient Sith origin lore becomes something you can walk through rather than simply read about. The Valley of the Dark Lords is a traversable environment. The tombs of Ajunta Pall, Tulak Hord, Marka Ragnos, and Naga Sadow are dungeons with dark side architecture and millennia of accumulated Force energy. Inside Ajunta Pall's tomb specifically, something happens that no other Sith Dark Lord receives in the expanded universe. His Force Ghost speaks. Jedi Force Ghosts in Star Wars offer wisdom. Ajunta Pall's ghost offers something different. Bound to the physical world across 30 centuries by whatever the dark side did to him that he couldn't undo. Existing in a state the sources describe as diminished, he identifies himself with a phrase that lands like a wound. I had a name once. Ajunta Pall. Yes, that was my name. I was one of many. We were servants of the dark side. The past tense is everything. I had a name once. He is the first Dark Lord of the Sith, the man who beheaded a king, claimed an empire, and founded a civilization that ran for nearly 2,000 years. And he describes his own identity in the past tense. He had a name. He was one of many. They were servants. Every verb is past. The present is just the tomb, and 30 centuries of dark side saturation, and the ghost of a Jedi Master who made a choice he has had 3 millennia to examine. His tomb in KOTOR includes a puzzle where Revan must identify the correct weapon among 3 blades, determining which one truly belongs to Pall. The game uses this as a mechanism for Pall's ghost to speak directly to Revan, about dark side tradition, about what it means to be a servant of the dark side, about the nature of the choice Pall made and where it led. The redemption arc embedded in this sequence, one of the very few a Sith Lord receives in all of Legends, involves Pall finding some form of resolution through his encounter with Revan. Not absolution, not erasure of what he built or what it produced. Something closer to being seen clearly, for perhaps the first time, by someone capable of understanding both what he was before and what he chose to become. The expanded universe's awareness of the structural parallel here is built into the design of the entire mythology. Ajunta Pall, Jedi Master, falls to the dark side, becomes the first Dark Lord of the Sith, redeemed in death. Darth Vader, Jedi Knight, falls to the dark side, becomes a Dark Lord of the Sith, redeemed in death in his son's arms. The first fallen Jedi, and the most famous fallen Jedi, 6,000 years apart in the timeline, finishing the same arc, the template and the echo. The Jedi Order that exiled the Jedi on Corbos hoped they would reflect on their mistakes. They didn't, for 6,000 years. And then Ajunta Pall did, alone in a tomb, talking to a man who had his own complicated history with the dark side. The connection to Sidious runs through different channels, but ends in the same place. Sin's Chronicle, the journal of the woman who was Pall's shadow hand and was plotting to overthrow him before he was even fully consolidated on the throne, became the oldest text in Darth Sidious's collected Darkside library. The Book of Sith begins with the woman who was there at the beginning, who watched Paul behead Hakagram Grouch and claimed her position in the new empire, who wrote the code that every Sith from that moment forward would be shaped by. Sidious, reading Sin's words as preparation for his own galactic ambitions, was reading the founding document of everything he inherited. The lineage. The direct chain from the exile at Corbos to the films runs like this. 7003 BBY, the Second Great Schism. 7000 BBY, the 100-Year Darkness begins. 6900 BBY, Corbos, the Exile, Korriban, the Sith Empire, and Sorza Sin writing the code on Ziost. 5000 BBY approximately, the Great Hyperspace War fragments the first Sith Empire's political structure. 1000 BBY approximately, Darth Bane destroys the Sith Brotherhood, establishes the Rule of Two, and potentially fulfills the Sithari prophecy Sin recorded 6,000 years earlier. Bane's lineage runs through a chain of masters and apprentices to Darth Plagueis, then to Darth Sidious, who engineered Anakin Skywalker's fall and thereby produced Darth Vader. Every sinister thing Vader ever did has a genealogy traceable to Corbos. To 12 Jedi Masters, the Jedi Order chose to exile rather than execute, who refused to reflect on their mistakes as the exile intended, and built a civilization instead. The Sith Empire's philosophical tradition, the code, the alchemy, the hierarchical structure of power, fed directly into Bane's reforms. Bane's reforms produced the Rule of Two. The Rule of Two produced Sidious. Sidious produced Vader. The Sithari prophecy, if it applies to Vader, closes a loop that Sorza Sin opened. Sin wrote the prophecy in 6900 BBY, noting it was a perversion of Jedi tenets. 6,900 years later, Darth Vader, Sith Lord, and simultaneously the Jedi Order's prophesied Chosen One, destroyed both the Sith and himself in the same act, fulfilling both traditions' promises at once. "The Force shall free me," Sin wrote. Vader's chains broke in the moment he chose to save his son. The Force was freed. The expanded universe built a mythology coherent enough to trace these threads across 7,000 years of internal history and have them resolve at a single moment on the Death Star 2. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when writers take world-building seriously enough to make the deep past consequential to the immediate present. That's what the Legends-era Sith origin lore was. A load-bearing structure, not a footnote. Vader's entire existence had deeper roots if you knew where to dig. The people who dug found something extraordinary. What they set aside. In April 2014, following Disney's 2012 acquisition of Lucasfilm, the expanded universe was officially reclassified as Legends, non-canonical, a separate continuity preserved but set aside. Everything confirmed above: the Second Great Schism, Sorza Sin's Journal, the Genjidai Exile, Ajunta Paul's Tomb, Tulak Hord and his erased opponent, the Sithari Prophecy, the Valley of the Sleeping Kings, all of it became optional. Korriban was renamed Moraband in the new canon. The civilization behind that name hasn't been rebuilt in Disney's continuity. The people who knew this material called it a masterpiece. Not uniformly perfect. No body of work assembled over decades by dozens of writers is uniformly perfect, but complete. A mythology with real depth, real philosophy, real tragedy, and internal coherence stretching across thousands of years of in-universe history. The kind of material that rewards return visits because every piece connects to every other piece. The Sith Code, written by the woman who was watching Ajunta Paul from the inside. The Sithari Prophecy, recorded by the same woman, possibly fulfilled 6 millennia later by the man the Jedi Order had its own prophecy about. The first Dark Lord's ghost, waiting 30 centuries in a tomb to have one honest conversation. That was here. All of it. Built and accessible and loved by the people who found it, and then classified as a legend. A civilization begins on a red planet. A former Jedi Master stands over the body of a king he just killed. Behind him, 11 other exiles, 100 years of war in their past, unknown space in every direction. One of them, Sorza Sin, is already writing. She'll write the code. She'll record the prophecy. She'll document the founding of an empire built on the worst day of these people's lives, and she'll note, with the clinical precision of someone who was trained as a Jedi before she chose otherwise, that she is planning to overthrow the man who just claimed the throne. Ajunta Paul claims it anyway. The Valley of the Sleeping Kings waits on the horizon. Tulak Hord hasn't been born yet. Marka Ragnos is 2,000 years away. The Rule of Two is 6,000 years away. Vader is 6,900 years away. 3 millennia from now, in that same valley, Paul's ghost will say, "I had a name once." He will describe himself as someone who had been, past tense. Everything past. This was the story. Thousands of years of it, internally coherent, built to reward the people who took it seriously. It was called a masterpiece by the readers who found it. It was set aside in 2014. The lore still exists, still readable, still playable, still exactly as detailed as it ever was. Legends isn't destroyed. It just doesn't count. You just saw it count. Subscribe if you want more of this.